going to talk you through some of the key terms in Tasmanian EIA as another way of introducing you to how things work here. If you don't have any familiarity with environmental impact assessment or planning, it's probably feeling like a lot at the moment. So I'm just going to go through about 10, 12 key terms, and hopefully you will have heard of these before, just to make it a little bit easier to move forward. So we've talked about the key role of the developer in environmental impact assessment or any kind of planning process. You'll also hear them called the proponent. So we're going to be using both of these words a lot. So the proponent is the person who comes up with an idea, whether it's to expand a quarry or build a pulp mill or build a cableway or put a pretty modest shed. There's a new rage for building home offices in backyards. They're all the developer, and we'll also call them the proponent. The proponent puts in a development application. So I don't have an actual application. I could probably find one easily enough, but it's a form where you say what your name is. I have copied part of the planner's report that went in with the Mount Wellington Cableway Company application. So the development application is where the developer, in this case, because it was such a complicated case, through a planning consultant, applied to council with all the necessary environmental and development information so that the planners could put it out for public comment and ultimately make a recommendation to council. Council then votes on it. So a development application most of the time is a reasonably simple affair, but because the complicated ones tend to be the ones that hit the news, we do sometimes end up talking about quite complicated examples. So a development is anything that's proposed that's not there currently, and environmental impact assessment is that process of thinking, okay, let's have a conversation about this with all of the people who need to be in that conversation and decide whether it's acceptable through this process that we've set down in law. So home offices in backyards is a bit of a thing to give people a bit of separation between home and work. And so with any development, you're wanting to know how big is it, where is it located on the property, how might the neighbours be affected, does it fit with what's allowed in the planning scheme? And with any property, so this is from a real estate site, so you can see a property here, which happens to be number 1 Trumpeter Street in Battery Point. Then before the development application goes in, the developer, or maybe the planning consultant who's being paid by the developer because they don't want to do all the work themselves, thinks about how this might impact. Is there any vegetation clearing? Is a heritage area affected? This will trigger a heritage overlay. What might those environmental impacts be? And so the thing about EIA is that every new development is unique. So even if it's the same shed, the shed going in here in Trumpeter Street in Battery Point is going to be different to the same shed that goes into a backyard in Claremont or Mount Nelson, where maybe bush is affected. You can see in the background, for those of you who aren't from Hobart, the casino and the lovely hills above the University of Mount Nelson. Any development on those fringes there will trigger concerns about views and skyline and vegetation clearance. So we will talk about the Coonya Quarry expansion at some point, completely different kind of environmental impact assessment that triggered a higher level assessment that ended up going to the Environmental Protection Authority. It wasn't just managed by council, but council took the application in the first instance. So here they'd be worried about truck movements affecting neighbours, dust, water flow, where's the water going from the expanded operation. So all sorts of entirely different impacts. Oh, eagles. There was an eagle nest not that far from here, and one oldness actually on the site. So the environmental impact thinking that either the consultant or the council or the EPA has to do here is completely different from the thinking about how significant trees and heritage might be affected in the case of a backyard shed in the middle of suburbia. Planning schemes is the set of rules by which we have the conversation. So this is a good thing in that the rules are pretty clear, even though they're reasonably complicated. This also becomes frustrating because there's only so much in the planning scheme, and some things that people really care about are going to end up being outside the planning scheme, and there's really no control on it, and changes can be made that people are upset about that nobody has any power to do anything about. So this is a screenshot from the Environmental Defenders Office Handbook about how the resource management and planning system in Tasmania achieves its lofty objectives about protecting the environment, intergenerational equity, sustainability, having economic development without overly impacting the environment, all those really important things that we have agreed as a society and put into law that planning schemes should try to do, then filter down to these basic rules. So can that shed go into the backyard, and how high can it be? All those different controls. Yeah, lots of details in planning schemes, but they are really important as the kind of first step of working through whether the environment can be impacted or not. Planning officers are important, and we will talk about them quite a bit, and some of you who are doing the Master of Planning might be hoping to one day occupy a planning officer position or maybe a planning consultant position. Some of the people doing Bachelor of Surveying and Spatial Science will need to know this because you'll be involved in talking to planning officers or planning consultants. So this is a screenshot of the very many documents that were submitted as part of the Mount Wellington Cableway proposal, and my representation at the top of this list of files. So this was pretty over the top. You can see here it was a large and controversial development, and so a lot of different aspects of potential environmental impact were assessed. Aboriginal heritage, noise, biodiversity, fire. There's of course the social side, community benefit analysis, but a lot of this focuses on reports about the environment, the physical environment, contaminated land, geotechnical, odour, couldn't fit them all in, a lot. So the planning officer is the person who should be contacted pretty early in the process when, in this case, Mount Wellington Cable Car Company are intending to do something. Contact is made with council just to make sure that everybody understands what's required to be submitted as part of the development application. So planning officers have a very key role in mediating this conversation about environmental impact assessment and informing the public in making a recommendation, an expert recommendation based on the rules to the people who are going to make a decision. Public notice period is in most cases 14 days, and that's the time that people have to make comment on a development application. So this is a screenshot from the Hobart City's planning page about timeframes. And yeah, so if you're a neighbour, and I'm anticipating a letter in the mail any day now because my neighbour is about to put in a development application, and I will have 14 days to say the ways in which I object to that really large extension, and I am entitled to put anything in that letter, but really the power comes from me knowing the planning scheme and objecting on that basis. So the public notice period starts when the planning officer puts a notice in the local paper, puts actual physical notices up at each public frontage. So if it's a complicated block with numerous public frontages, notices have to go on each, and sends neighbours and the occupier of the land, if that isn't actually the owner there, send them all letters saying this is what is being proposed. Representations are, of course, the way in which the public have their say. It's a letter or an email, usually an email, that is sent to council or another planning authority, but we'll leave the complexities of that aside for the moment and just take the cases that are dealt with by council. So this is the first part of my representation about planning 19345, which is 100 Pinnacle Road and 30 McRobbie's Road, South Hobart, which is of course the cableway. And to make things a little easier for the poor planning officers who had to process 17,500 of these, I said right up the front that I'm opposed to the development rather than supporting the development or some kind of sitting on the fence position, and said why: visual impact, biodiversity impacts, Aboriginal heritage, waste, noise and traffic, and then went into details about each of these. I suspect that the planning officer probably opened these, noted those 6 things and didn't read a whole lot more, maybe just skimmed it, because representations aren't votes. It's important that things are raised, but then each aspect where a development might not be fitting the rules just gets considered on its own merits, and it doesn't matter whether one person has raised it or 17,000 people have raised it. It gets considered and the rules are read and a recommendation is made. The list stands for Land Information Systems Tasmania, which we all love because it's amazing, and most of the time the function that we use in the list is list map. So this is the way that you can cruise around and open up all sorts of amazing layers, and without leaving your desk, get a fair insight into where a property is, what shape it is, what the context is. Yeah, really quite amazing. A resource that a lot of other states are very jealous of. Zones, this should be familiar to you by now. Every location is covered by a zone. It's not ambiguous. There's a sharp boundary. So in this particular picture of Battery Point, which is in a Hobart, it's really clear which part is in a residential, which is the funny red colour, which is the business zone, central business zone, which is the blue, which is open space, which is green. Each area of land or parcel of land has a zone, and then there are rules about what can and can't happen in that zone. And this is really important for environmental impact assessment, because you can only apply to do things that are allowed in the zone, and if you want to do something different, you have to apply for rezoning. We won't get into the complexities of that, but just to know that each zone has a character and there's an intention about what future developments look like in terms of fitting into the zone, and this is really a fundamental aspect to the way that environmental impact assessment works. Then there are codes and overlays, because while each area of land has a general zone, and it's residential or it's commercial or it's industrial, there are aspects that move across zones, or that might be the wrong way of putting it, that don't necessarily respect political or artificial zones. So this could be flooding. In this case, this is a screenshot of the list from 78 Geilston Bay Road, Geilston Bay. You can see in the top we know that that's the address that I've typed in list map, and a pin has appeared at 78 Geilston Bay Road, Geilston Bay, and then I have turned on the Tasmanian Interim Planning Scheme overlay layer in list map, and then any layers that apply pop up, and this is the bushfire prone area. So really important, because codes will override zones if there's any conflict, and it might be that there are biodiversity controls, for example, which there are in this case, that restrict what you're able to do in terms of impacting the environment. Planning scheme amendment, this is really briefly mentioned in Nicole Summers' video, where she talks you through local government or council level planning, and this is a case where the development doesn't fit the zone and they apply for rezoning. So this is an option that's available to developers, to the proponent, and it's just another step and lengthens the process and further complicates the process. But if you so desire, you want to build something that in this case is really very different to what exists in Dolphin Sands. So this is near the township of Swansea on Tasmania's east coast, a really amazing, beautiful part of the state. A huge and quite complicated development that didn't fit the zone means that proponent had to apply to the Tasmanian Planning Commission for a planning scheme amendment. It needed to go to council, and then council put the paperwork through to the Tasmanian Planning Commission for a rezoning. Not something we're going to talk about a lot, but I just wanted you to be aware of it because it comes up in Nicole Summers' video. Heritage is something that we have mentioned and we will mention, because at least in central Hobart, there's a lot of heritage listings. There's either heritage precincts where the whole area is covered by heritage controls. Some heritage precincts also have places that are heritage listed, and sometimes there's a heritage listed placed in the middle of an area that isn't a heritage precinct. Anyway, without mentioning too much of the complication of this process, heritage is something that needs to be considered at times in environmental impact assessment. It is part of the environment, like how things look, which we call visual amenity. As is Aboriginal heritage, incredibly important part of thinking about how the environment is affected. Unfortunately, unlike European heritage, Aboriginal heritage is dealt with incredibly poorly in law in Tasmania. It has its own separate act. The act desperately needs updating. It dates from 1975. It has been partly updated, but it is in the process of a really thorough overhaul at the moment. But unfortunately, all of the Aboriginal heritage controls are in that separate act, and that act doesn't talk to the planning system. So you can impact Aboriginal heritage quite significantly, and unless you're willing to voluntarily put it through this different process and you know about this different process, all sorts of aspects of Aboriginal heritage can be impacted and nobody says or does anything about it. We will cover that in more detail later. I haven't yet, it depends when you're listening to this video, mentioned the EPBC Act, but the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act is the national act, and even in quite small developments this can be important. So I'm mentioning it in this video about the key terms because you will hear people say EPBC, and this is what is meant. There are 9 matters where the Commonwealth wants to get in on the conversation about environmental impact, and those are different attributes of the property, whether it's World Heritage listed, National Heritage listed, whether it's a wetland that's actually formally listed under something called the Ramsar Convention, whether it's Commonwealth listed threatened species and ecological communities that actually have to be on a Commonwealth list, not a state list, or can be both, but it has to be listed under EPBC. Migratory species protected under international agreements, marine areas, GRIMPA, Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, nuclear actions, and water as it relates to coal seam gas and large coal mining developments. These are all ways in which the Commonwealth Government has international obligations, and so it wants to be part of the conversation about impact assessment. We will deal with this in detail later in semester, but I need to mention it under key terms because even in quite modest developments, potentially even, this is rarely the case, but sometimes even when you're proposing a home office in a backyard, depending on where your backyard is, you might have a listed Commonwealth threatened species in your backyard that could be affected, and it triggers a referral to the Commonwealth Minister for a decision. They might decide that it's not something that they want to make a decision about, and they say, thanks very much, you can go away now. But EPBC is a really important layer to consider in environmental impact assessment. RMPS is, as I've already said in this video, the resource management and planning system, and it has objectives, and all of this other detail is seeking to uphold these objectives. LUPA is the Land Use and Planning Appeal Act. It is one of the two core acts of the way that environmental impact assessment is managed in Tasmania. So it sets up the planning scheme process, the permit system, and the appeal system for anybody who not happy with the outcome of the main planning permit system. LUPA is important, something more important for the planners to get their head around rather than people who are more focused on environmental impact assessment and perhaps coming at it from a specialist perspective like biodiversity or surveying. But still, it is important to know that LUPA is an important way that the environment is controlled. MCA is super important for all of you because MCA is the Environment Management and Pollution Control Act, and it is the main way that larger, more substantial developments that have the potential to impact the environment in more serious ways is managed. So this could be all sorts of pollution and other environmental problems, as is stated here in the EDO handbook. And again, if any decision that's made under here can be taken to appeal, but yeah, more substantial impacts like noise and impacts from wind farms, in fish farming, all go through Environmental Management and Pollution Control Act, and that Environmental Protection Authority might get involved. So the MCA has in law these different levels of activities, level 1, 2 and 3. Most of what we're going to talk about, at least in the first half of the semester, they're all level 1 activities. So they're pretty modest. The potential for environmental impact is relatively low, and so it goes through a more modest level of impact, because a fundamental principle of environmental impact assessment is that the assessment is at a level that's appropriate with a potential environmental harm. So because the Mount Wellington Cableway has a pretty serious potential for environmental harm, a lot of expense had to go into the reports. This is one of those things that's still only assessed at level 1, but there are a list of activities that automatically have quite a large potential for environmental impact, things like abattoirs and salmon farming, marine farming, that automatically go through to a higher level assessment that the Environmental Protection Authority does rather than Council does, so that you can get expert input. There is also level 3 activities, which are really huge complicated ones like pulp mills, we won't talk much about them because a whole different ball game, so to speak. I really want you to get your head around how level 1 works in particular in this unit, but also a little bit of level 2. So just know that a separate set of processes exist for really big developments, and all of the processes, no matter what size, are all written into law through MCA. EPA, as I said, is important because they get involved in larger, more complicated developments where you have people who are expert at project managing what should be assessed and managing all of those reports and making recommendations, and the council has to abide by any decisions that the EPA make about development. So I've got a screenshot here from the EPA webpage. Go to the assessments tab, which is the second one in. I think the homepage probably just lands you on EPA Tasmania. Go the next one in, and there's all sorts of interesting information here about the process. Lots and lots of details about assessments that have been made. Yeah, quite a rich source of information about what happens when somebody proposes something that has quite a high likelihood of impacting the environment. Final slide, the EDO handbook is your best friend and best resource. I won't be suggesting a lot of other readings for anybody who's doing the third year unit, KGA 381, because there's just so much to get your head around without going into the academic literature. That's where the postgrad course comes in and kicks things up a notch. And we critique EIA through the lens of the academic literature. But please, if you are feeling confused, I think going back to the EDO handbook and reading relevant sections, even if you read chapter 5 over and over and over again, it's a really good way to get your head around basic terms, and consistent effort will be rewarded. So do keep at it.